The autumn rain came down hard, relentless, turning the dirt roads into rivers of thick, sloshing mud. Sarah Mitchell's boots sank deeper with every step as she struggled to push forward, the weight of exhaustion heavy on her shoulders. She hadn't seen shelter in days, and the journey had drained her, body and soul. The sky was dark, heavy with more rain to come, and the air had turned cold, biting through her wet clothes. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she glanced back at the three emaciated cattle that trailed behind her, barely able to keep up. They were hers, the last of her father's legacy, and they too were on the edge of giving out. Without shelter tonight, they wouldn't survive. She had been walking for what felt like forever, searching for a place to rest, to find a home for herself and the few animals she had left. But everywhere she went, the towns turned her away. Single women with livestock weren't welcome, not in these parts. And now, it seemed, the road itself had conspired against her. The rain had soaked her to the bone, and her hopes were as wet as the land beneath her feet. She could see nothing but the endless, gray horizon. But then, through the thick veil of rain, she saw something. A break in the storm, a flicker of hope. A large ranch appeared in the distance. It wasn't much more than a silhouette at first, but as she drew closer, she made out a barn, pastures, and the warm curl of smoke rising from a chimney. The sight made her heart skip, but there was no time to waste. Her cattle were on the verge of collapsing, and if they didn't find shelter soon, they wouldn't make it through the night. She pushed them forward, hoping against hope that someone would be kind enough to offer her a place to stay, for just one night. As she drew near the ranch's large wooden gate, a figure appeared on the porch. The man stood tall, weathered by years of hard work and solitude. His eyes, dark and steady, studied her from across the distance. Sarah stopped, her heart in her throat, unsure of what to do. The man didn't speak right away. He simply watched as she approached, his gaze calculating, as if weighing her and her situation in the few moments it took for her to reach the gate. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, but she didn't look away. "Those cattle yours?" he asked finally, his voice low, firm. "Yes, sir," she replied, her throat tight. She swallowed hard before continuing. I'm looking for work. Anywhere to shelter them. Just for tonight." He studied her face for a long moment. The wind howled, and the rain beat down harder, but neither of them moved. His eyes flicked over to the cattle, their legs shaky beneath them, their coats matted with mud. Then he asked, his voice almost a whisper, "You running from something?" Sarah's heart lurched. She shook her head slowly, each word a heavy weight in her chest. "No, sir. Just running toward survival." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the cattle, then back to her. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Sarah could feel his internal struggle. He was weighing something in his mind, deciding whether to offer help. She waited, her hand gently brushing the handle of her wagon, her body frozen in the cold. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady. "Bring them through the gate. North Pasture has a shelter." She stood there for a moment, disbelief washing over her. She hadn't expected such kindness, but the feeling of relief that followed was so powerful she could hardly contain it. "Thank you, sir," she managed, her voice thick with gratitude. It wasn't the plea of a desperate woman, but a statement of dignity. She would not beg, not even now. As she led her cattle through the gate, the man stayed by the porch, watching her every move. She worked with efficiency despite the exhaustion in her limbs, guiding the cattle into the shelter as best as she could. The animals huddled together, their breathing heavy but calmer now that they were out of the rain. But just as she finished, she turned to leave. She hadn't come here to overstay her welcome. "And you?" The man's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Where will you shelter?" Sarah froze, the question hanging in the air like a weight. She turned slowly, looking at him, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't planned on asking for more, but she knew, deep down, that without a place to sleep, she would have to keep moving, keep searching for a place to rest. The fear of what would come next, the unknown, pressed against her chest. He studied her for a moment longer before offering a final suggestion. I have a bunkhouse. Needs work done around here. You know ranch work? Her eyes met his. Hope and fear collided in that instant, and she nodded. Yes, sir. I know it well. The man's gaze softened for just a moment, but it was enough to change everything. Spring's coming fast. You're safe here until then. She nodded again, grateful for the shelter, for the chance to rest, to rebuild. And as the rain continued to fall around them, the question remained unspoken between them both. What would come next after the spring? The warmth of the ranch house felt like a dream after days of wet, cold misery, and Sarah took a deep breath as she stepped inside, feeling the crackling heat of the stove on her skin. Galen Thompson, the man who had offered her shelter, motioned for her to sit by the fire while he started to lay out the terms of their arrangement. He was clear, direct, his voice carrying a weight that told her this wasn't a man who made promises lightly. You'll work for your room and board. I'll shelter your cattle in the north pasture, but you'll need to tend them. I'll have work for you. Fence mending, cooking, cleaning, animal care. Pays nothing, but the shelter's yours until spring, until the 1st of May. After that, you'll have to move on. Sarah nodded slowly, her hands still trembling from the cold as she clutched the cup of coffee he had given her. She hadn't tasted anything so warm in weeks. The terms weren't ideal, but they were enough for her. She had nothing left but these cattle and her willingness to work. I agree. You won't regret this, Mr. Thompson, she said, trying to hide the gratitude and relief in her voice. Just Galen, he replied with a quiet, almost gruff tone. And I'm not in the business of regrets. His words echoed in her mind as she looked into his dark eyes, wondering what kind of man would offer such an arrangement to a stranger. She had no answers, but she would accept it for the sake of survival, for herself and her cattle. That night, as she settled into the small, dusty bunkhouse he had provided, Sarah couldn't help but feel a bittersweet sense of relief. The bunkhouse wasn't much, small and rough around the edges, with peeling walls and a rickety wooden bed, but it was dry, and it was warm, a shelter against the storm outside. By lamplight, she cleaned the place, wiping down surfaces and folding the worn bedding. For the first time in weeks, she had the luxury of a hot meal, simple beans and bread, but it was enough to fill her belly. She sat alone at the small wooden table, finally warm, finally safe. A soft sigh escaped her lips, and then the tears came, quiet, silent tears that she didn't allow herself to release in front of Galen. Through the small window, she saw him still inside the main house, sitting by the fire, reading. He was alone, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had brought him to this place of solitude. The question lingered in her mind long after she had finished her meal and climbed into bed, the exhaustion of the last few days finally taking its toll. The next morning came early, cold and clear. Sarah rose with the dawn, knowing the first thing she needed to do was check on her cattle. They had recovered somewhat after the shelter, but she could tell they were still weak. She had no choice but to keep working, to keep moving forward. When she stepped outside, she saw Galen already at work, tending to a water trough near the barn. His movements were steady, practiced, and it seemed as though he never rested. She gave him a nod as she passed, and he acknowledged her with a simple grunt. There was no need for words. As they worked side by side, the morning passed in a quiet, efficient rhythm. It was a dance that Sarah had known all her life, one she had learned from her father. Galen seemed to notice her competence, the way she moved with purpose despite her exhaustion. He didn't comment, but she could see the slight approval in his gaze when she fixed a fence post or handled the cattle with care. His routine was predictable, and she quickly became attuned to it. When he'd check the horses, when he'd inspect the fences, when he'd disappear into the barn to take care of the feed. He was a solitary man. Sarah could tell that much. The ranch was large, well kept, but it had a loneliness about it. There were no other workers, only Galen, and the house, though orderly and functional, was devoid of warmth, no decorations or signs of life, just the bare essentials. As Sarah settled into the rhythm of ranch life, she began to notice the small ways in which she was slowly making a place for herself. She sewed a curtain for the bunkhouse window, mended a rug she found in the barn, and cleared a small plot of land for a garden. She didn't ask for permission, she simply did it. She could tell he noticed, but he never commented. There was no need. He didn't seem to speak much about anything, but when he did, it was clear he had a sharp mind beneath that stoic exterior. One evening, after a long day's work, Galen surprised her by speaking more than usual. "You work hard," he said, his voice low. "More than I expected." Sarah glanced up at him, wiping her hands on her apron. "I earn my keep. Always have." Galen studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing but thoughtful. "Where'd you learn ranch work?" he asked. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. "My father," she said softly. "Before he died, before we lost everything." A long silence passed between them. There was understanding in his eyes, something unspoken that seemed to pass through the air. "Spring comes fast here," he said after a moment. 5 months. Sarah nodded, but there was something in his voice that made her wonder. What did he mean by that? She didn't ask, but the question stayed with her. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about the spring deadline he had mentioned. It seemed too specific, too definite. She couldn't help but feel that it wasn't just about her staying. There was something more, something in his eyes, in the way he spoke, that made her realize he wasn't just marking time until she left. He, too, was waiting for something, though she couldn't quite figure out what. For now, though, she had work to do, and the spring deadline would come whether she understood it or not. It was a puzzle she would have to solve in time, but for now, she had 5 months to make this place feel like home again. 6 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival at Galen's ranch, and life had slowly settled into a routine, one that, though simple, felt like the first semblance of stability she'd known in a long time. The cold winter mornings had become a familiar rhythm. Sarah rose early, always the first awake, and she started the fire in the bunkhouse stove before heading to the main house to prepare breakfast. By the time Galen was up, she had coffee brewing and breakfast ready, the small routines of the day unfolding in a way that made the space around her feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a place she could finally belong. Galen's mornings were quieter. He fed the horses, checked the fences, and took care of the larger tasks, always working with the quiet precision of a man who had grown used to solitude. The mornings were the same, a brief exchange of words, mostly practical, then the quiet hum of work shared between them. Midday, they ate together, but it was often silent, just the sound of utensils scraping on plates and the occasional glance exchanged when one of them found a moment to pause. After lunch, they worked separately, though always within earshot, aware of each other's presence, but allowing the silence to settle back in. As Sarah's workdays passed, the ranch began to change. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was making it hers, slowly weaving herself into the fabric of the place. The cattle she had brought with her had flourished, growing stronger, their numbers now more integrated with Galen's herd. They moved through the pastures together, a silent testament to her ability to care for them, to protect them. The bunkhouse, too, had slowly become a home, not just a shelter. She sewed a curtain for the window, mended a rug she'd found tucked away in the barn, and cleared a small patch of land for a garden. Galen never commented on her efforts, but she could see the approval in his eyes when he found the new additions to the place. The main house, too, had taken on a little warmth. Sarah didn't ask permission to clean the kitchen or organize it in a way that felt more efficient. She simply did it, and though Galen said nothing, he didn't need to. He would find his shirts neatly folded or an extra stack of firewood by the door when he came in from his rounds. It was clear, in the smallest gestures, that she was becoming a part of the routine here. Even the way they moved around each other spoke of an unspoken understanding. The evenings, though often quiet, felt easier, the silence more comfortable. Galen's meals were always simple: roast meats, bread, and beans, but Sarah had a way of making them feel like something more. She was efficient in the kitchen, turning small, plain ingredients into meals that felt like a luxury after the long, cold days of hard work. Galen noticed, though he never said much. It was in the way he lingered over his food, in the way his movements had become more relaxed around her, as if she had earned her place here, not just by working, but by making the place feel alive again. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Galen spoke more than usual. "You work hard, more than I expected," he said, his voice rough but appreciative. Sarah looked up from a dish she was washing, surprised by the compliment. "They're my keep. Always have," she replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Where'd you learn ranch work?" Galen asked. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then answered, "My father. Before he died. Before we lost everything." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the shared weight of loss. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the silence not uncomfortable, but filled with an unspoken understanding. After a moment, Galen spoke again. "Spring comes fast here." "5 months," he said, his tone distant, as if he were reminding himself more than her. Sarah nodded, though a knot tightened in her chest. 5 months. She couldn't escape the feeling that the spring deadline he had mentioned wasn't just about her leaving. It was something deeper, something she couldn't yet understand. She didn't ask, but the question lingered in the back of her mind. That night, as she lay in the small bunkhouse, she found herself unable to sleep. The thought of spring, of the end of her time here, pressed heavily on her. She had come to this ranch as a last resort, but now, with each passing day, the feeling of home grew stronger. She could see it in the way the ranch was changing. It wasn't just about the work. It was the little things, how she was making it hers, how Galen's presence, though solitary, no longer felt as cold as it once had. But the shadow of the spring deadline still loomed, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Galen, too, was waiting for something. It wasn't just her departure he was marking. There was something about that deadline that was personal, something buried deep beneath the surface. She couldn't ask, couldn't bring herself to push him for answers, but she couldn't ignore it either. Winter had only just begun, but the winds of change were already stirring. She didn't know where it would take them, but she felt something shifting between them. The space that had once felt impossibly wide between her and Galen was narrowing. And though she didn't understand it all, she couldn't help but feel that whatever was coming, she wasn't ready for it to end. Yet, the cold wind bit through Sarah's coat as she sat quietly beside Galen in the wagon, the horse's hooves crunching over the frozen earth. He had mentioned needing supplies, and she had asked if she could go along, partly to get a few things for herself, but mostly to see the town she had only heard about. She had been isolated here for weeks, only the ranch and the cattle her world. Galen didn't say much during the ride, but that was typical. He was a man of few words. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though. They had settled into an easy understanding, and she felt a quiet connection between them that didn't need to be spoken aloud. As they approached the small settlement, Sarah could see the outline of the town, a few scattered buildings, the church steeple rising above them, and a single street lined with wooden houses and shops. It was a frontier town, rough and bare bones, but there was a certain charm to it. The bustle of the place, small as it was, reminded Sarah of the life she had once known before everything had gone wrong. When they reached the general store, Sarah could feel the eyes on her immediately. The people in town had clearly noticed Galen's arrival, and they noticed her too. It was the first time she had felt the weight of their judgment, and it wasn't lost on her. As Galen led the horses toward the hitching post, Sarah climbed down, smoothing her skirts, trying to look unassuming. Mrs. Porter, the storekeeper, was the first to approach, her eyes narrowing as she recognized Galen. "Galen Thompson," she called out with a hint of surprise. "Haven't seen you in months. What's got you back in town?" Galen gave her a brief nod, but didn't say much. Then Mrs. Porter's gaze shifted to Sarah, her eyebrows raising. "And who's this?" she asked with a sly smile. "Sarah Mitchell," Sarah replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I work at his ranch." Mrs. Porter didn't seem convinced. "Works there," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Just the two of you?" The question felt sharp, loaded, and Sarah could feel herself stiffen at the implication. "That's right," Galen answered shortly, his tone not inviting further discussion. Mrs. Porter's eyes flicked back to Sarah, clearly forming her own conclusions, but she didn't press the matter any further. The tension between them hung in the air like a storm cloud as they moved inside the store. Sarah kept her gaze down, doing her best to avoid the whispered conversations that started up as soon as they entered. It was impossible not to hear the women's quiet murmurs as they circled her, sizing her up. "How long have you been staying with Mr. Thompson?" Mrs. Porter asked, her tone as sweet as sugar but heavy with judgment. "6 weeks," Sarah answered, keeping her voice steady. "And you're staying in the house?" one of the women asked, her eyes lingering on Sarah's clothes. Sarah met her gaze firmly, despite the discomfort she felt. "I'm staying in the bunkhouse, ma'am. I work for Mr. Thompson." "Of course," the woman said, her smile thin. The conversation continued in the same vein, questions that felt more like subtle accusations. Sarah held her ground, offering only the barest details about herself, but she could feel the underlying discomfort, the judgment in the air. She had learned long ago how to stand tall in the face of such scrutiny, but that didn't mean it didn't weigh on her. As Galen finished his business at the feed store, he walked back to the wagon, his expression unreadable, but Sarah could tell he had noticed the shift in the room. The gossip was impossible to miss. As they left the store and climbed back into the wagon, Sarah kept her head down, avoiding Galen's gaze. The tension between them was palpable, and though neither of them said a word, Sarah could feel the weight of the unspoken words. The ride back to the ranch was silent, too silent, the air thick with what hadn't been said. Finally, Galen broke the quiet. "Town bothered you," he said, his voice low. It wasn't a question, but Sarah could hear the concern beneath his words. "People think what they think," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "They think wrong," he said firmly, his jaw tightening. She glanced at him, meeting his gaze for a moment. "Does it matter?" she asked. "Come spring, I'll be gone anyway." She didn't know why she said it, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. Galen was silent, his hands tight on the reins as they bounced along the muddy road. His words, when they came, were just as heavy as hers. "Maybe that's for the best," he muttered, but there was something in his voice that didn't match the words. Sarah knew, then, that he didn't want her to leave. There was more between them than either of them had acknowledged. That night, at dinner, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah ate quickly, keeping her distance, and though she knew Galen had noticed, he said nothing. It was as though the day had shifted something between them, and neither of them knew how to fix it. The unspoken emotions that had been building for weeks were now even harder to ignore. Later, when Galen and Sarah were alone in the kitchen, Galen spoke again, his voice softer now, though still edged with something unspoken. "They talk," he said quietly. "Let them," Sarah replied, her voice steady but her heart a little heavier. She wasn't sure if she was talking about the town or about the things between them, but it felt like both. "It's none of their business," he added. She nodded, but she knew the truth. It was only a matter of time before the town's gossip spread further. Galen's words, though, stayed with her long after the day had ended. She wanted to believe that his insistence on her staying wasn't just about needing help, but about something more. But with spring coming, she wasn't sure how much longer she could ignore the truth, that she was a temporary part of his life, and come spring, everything would change. That was the way of things here, and she wasn't sure if she could bear to face it. The harsh winter storm came out of nowhere, a silent warning in the sky before the blizzard hit with a force that swallowed up the landscape in minutes. Sarah had been out checking the cattle when it struck, the wind picking up suddenly, and before she could make her way back to the bunkhouse, the whiteout conditions overtook her. The world became a blur of snow and ice, the familiar landmarks of the ranch disappearing into a void of swirling white. Her heart raced as she tried to find her bearings, but the wind howled in her ears, and her feet slipped on the ice-covered ground. She knew she had to get back, but the storm was fierce, and the landscape was now an endless expanse of white. Panic began to rise in her chest as she stumbled through the snow, trying to retrace her steps, but everything looked the same. She lost track of time, her sense of direction fading with each passing minute. Cold seeped through her layers, her fingers numb, her body aching with the effort to keep moving. She fell once, then twice, the weight of exhaustion pulling at her. The world around her was growing darker, and the storm showed no signs of relenting. The ice on the creek was treacherous, and she didn't see it until it was too late. Her foot slipped, and with a sickening crack, she plunged through the thin ice, the cold water instantly soaking through her boots, numbing her legs. She gasped, struggling to pull herself out, but the current tugged at her, and the icy water sapped her strength. She barely managed to crawl to the edge, her body shaking violently from the shock. The cold was unbearable, and Sarah could feel the hypothermia starting to set in, her vision blurry and her thoughts sluggish. She had no idea where she was anymore, and the realization hit her that she might not make it back. Her legs refused to hold her up as she tried to stand, and her body gave way, collapsing against a fence post. The storm raged on, and the wind's howls seemed to mock her helplessness. The last thing she remembered before everything went black was her name, called out in a voice that carried through the storm like a lifeline. "Sarah! Sarah!" Galen's voice was rough, panicked. He had realized she was missing when she hadn't returned, and fear gripped him like nothing he had known in years. The snowstorm was blinding, but he couldn't leave her out there, not when the storm had taken a deadly turn. He grabbed a lantern and a coil of rope and set off into the blizzard, calling her name over and over, his heart racing with each step. He couldn't lose her. The fear of what might happen, of the prospect of finding her too late, drove him forward, his boots crunching through the deepening snow. The wind made it nearly impossible to hear anything, but he refused to stop, refused to give up. The thought of Sarah out there, alone, lost in the storm, had him pushing past his limits. He shouted her name, his voice hoarse, the cold seeping into his bones. But he kept going, praying he would find her. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, but eventually, through the swirling light, he saw her, collapsed against the fence, barely conscious. His heart lurched in his chest, and he rushed to her side, dropping to his knees in the snow. "Sarah," he called, his voice breaking as he reached for her. She was pale, her lips blue, her breath shallow and ragged. The reality of what he had feared hit him all at once, and panic surged through him. He couldn't lose her, not like this. He had already lost so much. He gathered her into his arms, trying to shield her from the wind, and with a desperate strength he didn't know he had, he carried her back through the storm. Every step felt like a battle against the snow and the cold, but he couldn't stop now. He wouldn't. His mind was a blur of worry and fear, and all he could think about was getting her inside, getting her warm. He stumbled through the snow, the lantern swinging wildly, his arms wrapped tightly around Sarah, praying she would hold on. By the time they reached the house, his hands were numb, his face stinging from the cold, but it didn't matter. What mattered was Sarah. He got her inside, the warmth of the fire in the hearth, a sharp contrast to the cold that had consumed her. He quickly stripped off her wet clothes, working as fast as he could, his hands shaking from the cold and the fear. The heat of the fire felt like nothing against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. He wrapped her in blankets, desperate to warm her, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. But there was nothing he could do but hold her, press warmth into her body, and pray she didn't slip away. Her breathing was shallow, her skin icy to the touch, and he felt like his own heart was breaking with the fear of losing her. He held her close, rubbing her hands, trying to bring the warmth back into her limbs. "Don't you die on me," he whispered, his voice rough. "Stay with me. Stay with me." He could barely hear her weak response, but she mumbled something he couldn't make out. Her body trembled violently, and it took every ounce of his willpower to keep from breaking down. It felt like hours, though in reality, it was only a matter of minutes. Slowly, the tremors in her body began to subside. Her breathing became a little steadier. The warmth was starting to return. When Sarah finally opened her eyes, her gaze was unfocused, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. "You scared me," Galen said, his voice low, the weight of the fear still lingering in his words. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice weak. "I got lost." He nodded, brushing her damp hair from her forehead. "I thought I'd lost you," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. The vulnerability in his words was something she had never expected from him. He had always been the strong, silent type, but now, in the quiet of the room, she saw something different in him. He had cared more than he had let on. "Don't leave me," he said softly, his hands gently holding hers. "Not like this." "I won't," she whispered, the weight of his words settling into her heart. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in a long while, Sarah believed it. In that moment, she wasn't just a woman trying to survive. She was part of something, part of him. The days following the storm were quiet, but the tension between Sarah and Galen had become palpable. The blizzard had shaken something loose between them, an unspoken understanding that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Sarah, still recovering from the near-death experience, had retreated inward, her emotions pulled tight like a coiled spring. She threw herself into her work, trying to keep her mind occupied, but it was harder now to ignore the way things had shifted. Galen had saved her, brought her back from the brink of death, and in doing so, he had broken down some of the walls she had so carefully built around herself. It was impossible to ignore the way he looked at her now, with a softness she hadn't seen before, a tenderness that went beyond mere concern. His actions had shown her how much he cared, but words, those were still elusive. They had both been through so much in their lives, too much to risk saying things that could change everything. But now, with winter's grip tightening around them and spring fast approaching, Sarah couldn't shake the growing realization that her time here was limited. She had made a deal with herself when she arrived at Galen's ranch. Stay until spring, work hard, and then move on. The deadline loomed larger with each passing day, and though she had found a sense of peace here, a feeling of belonging that she hadn't experienced in years, she couldn't shake the knowledge that it was all temporary. She had written letters to other towns, had sent out inquiries about jobs. Montana had sent her an offer, a respectable family looking for a housekeeper, and it was exactly the kind of work she needed. The offer was good, and the money would help her get back on her feet. But now that it was real, now that she had something concrete to hold on to, she hesitated. She knew leaving would hurt more than she could bear. She hadn't expected this, to want to stay. Not here, not with him. And yet, every day, she found herself longing for a future that didn't have a deadline, a future that didn't involve walking away from something that felt like home. As she sat at the small kitchen table, her letter to the Montana family in front of her, she felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She knew she had to make it soon, before the arrival of spring forced her to make the hardest choice of all. Galen was outside, tending to the horses, his back to her as he worked in the cold morning light. The sight of him brought an ache to her chest, one that she had been trying to ignore, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. She had no right to feel this way. He had done nothing to encourage it. And yet, his quiet presence, the way he cared for his land, his animals, the way he had cared for her, how could she walk away from that? How could she walk away from him? But she couldn't ignore the reality either. Spring was coming. She had made a promise to herself, and she had never been one to break her word. Yet, a part of her couldn't deny what she felt. A pull toward Galen, toward this life they had quietly built together. She couldn't pretend it wasn't there, no matter how much fear and doubt clouded her heart. That night, at supper, Sarah finally made her decision. She didn't want to keep running from the truth any longer. Galen had noticed the shift in her, the way she had pulled away, the way she had become more distant since the storm. He had watched her work hard, had seen her vulnerability, but he had also noticed the way she guarded herself. And now, with spring only a couple of months away, he saw the way her eyes lingered on the letters from distant places. He knew she was preparing to leave. The weight of it hung between them, thick and heavy. He didn't know how to ask her to stay, didn't know what he was offering her, but the thought of her walking out of his life again, of returning to a life of loneliness, was unbearable. After dinner, as they cleaned up in silence, he couldn't hold back any longer. "You're leaving, aren't you?" His voice was low, rough with the emotions he had kept buried for so long. Sarah froze, the question catching her off guard. She turned slowly, her heart racing. "I have an offer," she said quietly, not sure what else to say. "In Montana, a respectable family. It's good work." He stared at her, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to read the words she wasn't saying. "And you're going to take it?" The question came out more like a statement, a challenge, as if he was daring her to admit it. Sarah felt her chest tighten. "I have to," she said softly. "I can't stay here forever, Galen." The words stung more than she had expected, and the finality of them hit her harder than she realized. Galen took a deep breath, his jaw tightening, as if he were trying to hold back a wave of emotions. "You don't have to go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You could stay." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline, but it was still vague, unspoken. Sarah met his gaze, feeling her heart race. "Stay," she repeated. "You've got your ranch. You don't need me, Galen." He shook his head, taking a step closer to her. "I do need you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know it until now, but I do. More than I thought I would." His words shook her to her core. She had never expected this from him, never expected him to admit how much she had come to mean to him. But still, a part of her hesitated. She wasn't looking for pity, wasn't looking to be some kind of replacement for the woman he had lost. But his next words cut through her fear. "You're not a replacement, Sarah. You're the first thing that's made me want to live again. And I don't want you to go." The air between them seemed to change, thickening with the weight of his confession. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling her own tears threaten to spill. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave," he said simply. "I'm saying I don't know what it looks like, but I want us to figure it out." Her heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to stay, more than anything, but she couldn't shake the fear that this was just a fleeting moment of vulnerability, something that would fade when the storm had passed. But the truth was, she didn't want to let go of this of him. Not yet. "What if you don't know what you want?" she asked softly. He took her hand in his grip strong and certain. "Then I'll figure it out. But I want to try." She looked at him, uncertainty still in her heart. But a part of her knew that this was the choice. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had to decide whether to run or to stay. With her heart racing and her mind full of doubt, she made the decision to stay. For once, she wasn't running. Not anymore. And for the first time in years, she felt hope stir within her. The days leading up to the wedding passed with a quiet sense of anticipation that hung in the air like the calm before a storm. It was early spring, the cold of winter still clinging to the land, but the first signs of warmth were beginning to show. The snow that had once blanketed the ranch was melting slowly, the ground softening as the earth began to wake. It was a fitting time for new beginnings, and Sarah felt the shift in herself, in her heart. The decision she had made to stay was no longer just about surviving until spring. It was about choosing a life, about choosing Galen. They had spent the last several months building something together, slowly, carefully, one step at a time. She had come to the ranch as a desperate woman, willing to take any offer just to survive. But now, as she stood in front of the mirror in the small bedroom of the main house, watching the sunlight spill through the window, she could feel the transformation within her. The woman who had arrived months ago, broken and unsure, was gone. In her place stood someone with a sense of purpose, someone who had found not just shelter, but home. The soft rustle of fabric reminded Sarah of the dress she was wearing, simple but beautiful in its own way. It was the best Galen could afford, and though it wasn't fancy, it was all she needed. He had worked for it, and the effort he had put into getting it for her made it feel more precious than any gown from a store could have. As she adjusted the dress, smoothing the fabric down her body, she couldn't help but think of how far they had come. From the first night she arrived, soaking wet and desperate, to this moment, dressed in a simple dress, preparing for a life she never thought she'd have. A life with him. When she stepped outside, the sun was low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the ranch. It felt like a scene from a dream, one that she had never dared to hope for. Galen was already outside, his back to her as he stood near the barn, his hands on the fence. He turned as he heard the soft crunch of her boots on the ground, his eyes meeting hers. There was a quiet pride in his gaze, a pride she hadn't expected to see. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with the weight of everything they had been through, the hardships, the loneliness, the fears they had both carried for so long. But now, in this moment, there was only the present, and it was enough. He took a step toward her, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice rough but sincere. Sarah smiled, the warmth spreading through her at his words. She had never been one to need fancy things or grand gestures, but the way he looked at her, the way he saw her, was more than enough. She had never felt more seen, more understood. "Thank you," she whispered. She could feel her heart racing, a mix of nerves and excitement swirling inside her. There was so much they still didn't know about each other, so many things left unsaid. But the certainty of this moment, the certainty of what they were about to do, was enough to drown out the doubts. He reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers grazing her skin. "I never thought this day would come," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I thought I'd always be here alone." His words hit her hard, a reminder of the pain he had carried for so long, the grief that had haunted him for years. Sarah's heart ached for him, for the man he had been before she arrived, the man who had built a life from the ruins of his past, only to live in quiet solitude. "I'm glad it's you," she said softly, the words coming out without thinking. She had meant them, though. She was glad it was him, the man who had shown her kindness when she had nothing left to give. He had given her a chance, had shown her that she could be more than just a woman running from her past. She could be someone who was worthy of love, worthy of a future. His eyes softened, and he smiled, a rare smile that reached his eyes and made his whole face light up. "Me too," he murmured, as they walked toward the small gathering by the barn. Sarah couldn't help but notice how the place had changed. The ranch, once stark and empty, now felt alive. It was a place full of hope, of possibility. The work she had put into it had made it feel like home, like a place where they could build a future together. She looked around at the few neighbors who had come, the familiar faces of those who had become a part of their small community. Reverend Hayes stood at the front, a warm smile on his face as he waited for them to arrive. Galen and Sarah had kept the ceremony simple, just a few close people, those who had supported them, who had been there for them when they needed it the most. It wasn't a grand affair, but it didn't need to be. It was a reflection of their life, a life built on quiet moments, on small acts of love and kindness. When they reached the front, Galen took her hands in his grip firm but gentle. He looked at her, his eyes full of the same quiet certainty that she felt in her own heart. Reverend Hayes began the ceremony, his voice calm and steady as he spoke the words that would bind them together. Sarah listened, her heart full as she thought of the journey that had brought them to this point. It felt like a dream, like something she could hardly believe was real. And then, when it was their turn to speak their vows, Galen went first, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Sarah, I promise to give you shelter, not just from storms, but from loneliness, from fear, from ever feeling unwanted. I promise to choose you every day, to build a life with you, not just survive one. You brought me back to life, and I will spend mine making sure you never regret it. His words hit her like a wave, and she struggled to hold back the tears. It was more than she had ever expected, more than she could have imagined. When it was her turn, she squeezed his hands tightly, finding the strength to speak. Galen, I promise to make this ranch a home, to fill it with warmth and life, to stand with you in grief and joy. You offer me shelter when I had nowhere to go. Now I offer you my heart, my future, everything I am. I choose you today and always. The ceremony continued. The simple gold band slipped onto her finger, a symbol of the promise they had made to each other. And then, in the warm glow of the sun setting behind them, they kissed, tenderly, softly, with the promise of a future that had just begun. The celebration that followed was small, but filled with genuine warmth. There was roasted meat, bread, and preserves, a simple meal shared with those who had supported them. Someone had brought a fiddle, and Galen and Sarah danced, clumsily at first, but with laughter, their movements a mix of nerves and joy. For the first time in years, Galen's smile reached his eyes, and Sarah felt a lightness she had never known. As the evening drew to a close, and the last of the guests made their way home, Sarah and Galen stood together on the porch of their new life. The world around them was quiet, peaceful, and Sarah felt a sense of peace that she had never known before. The storms had passed, and in their place was the promise of something new. A life built on love, on second chances, and on the quiet certainty that they had found something real. Hand in hand, they looked out at the ranch, at the future they would build together. Think our child will believe this story? Sarah asked, a soft smile on her face. That we met because of a rainstorm and 3 cattle? Galen chuckled, squeezing her hand. I barely believe it myself, but I'm grateful for that storm every day. They turned to walk inside, the warmth of the fire waiting for them, the sound of their laughter echoing through the night. Their journey had only just begun, and as they stepped into their new life, they knew that together, they could face anything that came their way. They have shelter now, Sarah said, her voice full of contentment. So do we, Galen replied, his voice filled with a quiet pride. Finally,